So good evening, everyone. My name is Charlie Farrell, and I am the 2022-2024 Romer Bearden Graduate Museum Fellow here at the St. Louis Art Museum. I'm so excited to be delivering tonight's program, celebrating Juneteenth, creating our futures. Tonight, we'll be discussing legacies of Juneteenth. We'll open with a brief, localized history of Juneteenth to ground us in place. We'll then move to our panel, first by touching on a few objects in the museum's collection before diving into our conversation. After the panel discussion, there'll be a Q&A. That we'll be passing around mics. Please be sure to speak into the microphone so everyone is able to hear. Generous support is provided by the Art Bridges Foundation Access for All program. The first part of the program is going to be delivered by Gwen Moore. Gwen Moore is the Curator of Urban Landscape and Community Identity at the Missouri Historical Society, focusing on race, ethnicity, race relations, and social justice issues in St. Louis. Gwen has been associated with the Society since 1998, working as a researcher, community programmer, and oral historian. Her current area of research focuses on urban renewal and its destructive impact on community of colors. That interest has led her to an in-depth study of Mill Creek, the largest African-American residential area in St. Louis that was demolished in 1959. Please join me in welcoming Gwen Moore to the podium.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you, St. Louis Art Museum. I'm going to be covering, I think, some very familiar terrain. I think we all know about Juneteenth. I might be telling you a lot of things you already know, but there are a lot of ways that we can look at Juneteenth. First of all, let me say that Juneteenth is a very important holiday, not just important for African Americans, but it's important for all America. I particularly think it's important because it's a holiday that was created by Black people. It was created by freed men and freed women. It was a holiday that came from the grassroots. And it's been practiced by African Americans since 1866. So it's been around for a long time. But it's also important, I think, because it really calls into question and gets into the heart of the matter of democracy and what democracy means. And it gets very close to confronting the contradictions between American ideals and American reality. And that's a conversation that we're still having to this day. So let me start off by just saying that Juneteenth, the official designation, is the Juneteenth National Independence Day. Juneteenth became a national holiday June 17th, 2021. Of course, and like I said, it's been celebrated since 1866 by Black people. But it has many other names: Emancipation Day, Jubilation Day, Jubilee Day, Freedom Day, Black Independence Day, Second Independence Day. But just shorthand for Juneteenth. Everybody knows it as Juneteenth. But what was Juneteenth really about? Okay, and a lot of times, it was the day when Black people found out that they were free, the last Black people that found out that they were actually emancipated. And historians are starting to look at that closer. And they say it was the day, really, that enslavers in Texas were forced to accept emancipation. And this goes into the whole history of Texas, which I can't get into, the fact that they were a separate country that became part of the United States, and they became part of the United States to preserve slavery. So they were not happy with the outcome of the Civil War. So let me just quote two historians. One of them is the late Harry Jones. And Harry Jones was a curator, and he was the assistant director of the African American Civil War Museum, Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is what he said. Juneteenth does not mean the lie that's often spread, that's quite popular, That is the day that ignorant slaves in Texas received word that they had been freed on January 1st, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had to be enforced. And so Juneteenth means to me that Texas has been brought back in the Union. The other quote is from Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne is a professor, endowed professor at the University of Houston, is the foremost historian of the Black experience in the country. He's written some 40 books on Black history. And this is, in fact, he's working on a book that sort of contextualizes Juneteenth in Texas. When Texas was forced, Juneteenth was the day when Texas was forced at the point of a bayonet and the point of a rifle to drop slavery and rejoin the United States. So this is not just about delivering a message to slaves, to enslaved people. It was delivering a message to the enslavers. So it was a day that General Gordon Granger marched into Galveston, Texas, with some 2,000 soldiers, 1,800, 2,000 soldiers. And by the way, many of those soldiers were African Americans, and I think that's significant. And that's when he read General Order Number 3. And apparently he read this general order from the former headquarters of the Confederate Army. And I think this, I'm just going to read the first sentence or so. The people of Texas, not the black people of Texas, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the executives, who was Abraham Lincoln, who had since been assassinated, of the United States, all slaves are free. And I think this is really important. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And I'm not going to go with the rest of it, but that gets to the point. But this whole point about black people did not find out that they were free until 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Well, let's look at the Emancipation Proclamation. It was issued by Abraham Lincoln, September 22nd, 1862, and it was to go into effect January 1st, 1863. Now, what the Emancipation Proclamation said was that the enslaved people of those enslavers who were living in states that were in rebellion to the Union were free. However, Lincoln did not have jurisdiction over those 11 Confederate states. The 11 Confederate states had seceded. They had started their own country. They had their own president. They had their own currency. They were a separate country. So he could not free people that he did not have jurisdiction over. The other thing is, and I think this is more important, there were 5 slave states that remained in the Union. That was Missouri, where we are, of course. Missouri was a slave state, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and then later West Virginia. And Lincoln exempted those states from the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, if you were an enslaved person in Missouri before January 1st, 1863, you were still an enslaved person after January 1st, 1863. So the Emancipation Proclamation, in reality, freed no slaves, or very few slaves, practically none. There were 4 million enslaved people, and there were 4 million enslaved people before 1863 and after 1863. Now I want to talk about Missouri, because I think St. Louis played a really important role in this whole struggle. So the first Emancipation Proclamation was not issued by Abraham Lincoln. It was issued by John Fremont. John Fremont was over the command of the forces in the West, and he was based here in St. Louis. Of course, he was anti-slavery, of course. And St. Louis was a divided state. You know, there were pro-slavery forces, anti-slavery forces, but we were in the Union, very polarized. So Fremont wanted to make sure that he had total control over the state. And he was concerned about those pro-slavery forces in the state. So he issued a proclamation, a martial law, in which he declared that anybody that was not loyal to the Union, that he suspected of not being loyal to the Union, he would free their enslaved people. And just to drive that point home, he freed 2 enslaved people under his own signature. And they were the slaves of a man by the name of Thomas Snead and his wife. Thomas Snead was the aide-de-camp to the secessionist governor of Missouri, who was Claiborne Jackson. So he was sending a message loud and clear. If I'm going to free the enslaved people of this man, you better be on your P's and Q's. I'm coming after you. Now, the only problem is that Fremont did not have the authority to do this. And of course, Lincoln was not happy. Lincoln wanted to keep those border states in the Union. He needed them in the Union. That's why he did not want to free the enslaved people, because he did not want them decamping to the Confederacy. So he ordered Fremont to rescind that order. Fremont refused. Lincoln removed him from his post, replaced him, and he rescinded the order. So the first Emancipation Proclamation was not issued by Abraham Lincoln. It was actually issued by John C. Fremont. And I sometimes joke and say, you know, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed no slaves, at least Fremont freed two. Now, let me talk a little bit about the situation here in St. Louis. Like I said, it was a divided city. We had Unionists here, and Unionists were those people who, of course, were emancipationists. That's what they call themselves, emancipationists, not abolitionists. But there were two sections of these emancipationists. One was called the Claybanks, and one was called the Charcoals. The Claybanks were the more conservative emancipationists. They wanted to get rid of slavery, but they had no love for black people, of course. And they were thinking maybe it could be gradual. And then maybe after these black people were free, we'd send them away from here. They were believing colonization. Maybe they could go to Africa. Maybe they can go somewhere in South America, but they had to leave the country. The Charcoals felt differently. They wanted immediate emancipation with no strings attached. Well, they were able in October of 18, they were able to get one of their members elected to be the mayor of St. Louis, a gentleman by the name of Chauncey Philly. And in October of 1863, now this was just months after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, they had a convention, not a convention, they had a meeting at the courthouse, and they were demanding that Missouri have a constitutional convention where they declared the emancipation of black people with no strings attached, the immediate emancipation of African Americans, enslaved African Americans with no strings attached, no gradual, no colonization, just immediate emancipation. Now that happened, finally got that convention in January of 1865. And in that convention here in Missouri, and this was before the passage of the 13th Amendment, enslaved people in Missouri were declared free. And there was a big celebration, of course, dancing in the streets, fireworks, parades, everything. So I always say, black people knew definitely that they were free January 11, 1865. However, it actually took the 13th Amendment to actually free enslaved people. And it had to be done for it to become law. It had to be an amendment to the Constitution. And that did not happen until December of 1865. And another interesting note that ties it to St. Louis in Missouri was John Brooks Henderson, who lived here in St. Louis. John Brooks Henderson was a senator from Missouri, and he was the co-author of the 13th Amendment. So getting back to this whole national story and why the 4th of July why the 4th of July has been so problematic for so many African Americans. I just remember my grandfather saying we could not celebrate the 4th of July because he was not free. And I think a lot of black people felt that way about the 4th of July. It didn't feel like it was a holiday for us. And Frederick Douglass, who was, of course, the preeminent black leader, I always call him the Martin Luther King of the 19th century, one of the most famous African Americans in the country at the time, brilliant orator, gave many, many speeches, many famous speeches. And this is one of his most famous speeches, which was delivered in, as you can see, July 5th, 1852. What to the slave is the 4th of July? And what he said is a very long speech, and of course I'm not going to read it. But one of the things he said, which I really liked the way he put it, he called it a sham, he called it a fraud, he called it hypocrisy, he called it deception, he called it hollow mockery, and mere bombast. And those were the nice things he said about the 4th of July. So that was what the 4th of July meant to so many black people, especially when you're talking about 1852, when he said black people were in chains. You were celebrating independence. You were celebrating freedom. You were celebrating this throwing off the chains from the British, while your fellow human beings you had imposed chains upon. So this is why the 4th of July always rang hollow to so many African Americans. So this is what Juneteenth means. It completes the spirit, the intent, and the promise of July 4th, 1776. Without Juneteenth, I don't think July 4th has any meaning. No, it doesn't have any real meaning. And by the way, this particular photograph that you see is from a celebration in Richmond, Virginia in 1906. So it shows you how widespread and how popular this holiday was in Black America. And now it's going to be the same kind of holiday that it is in the rest of the country. We're going to see the same kind of things. And during Juneteenth, it's a time for celebration. It's a time for rejoicing. But it's also a time for solemn remembrance. And it's a time for reflection. And like I said before, it's a time to really come to grips with how American reality is so divorced from American ideals. Those American ideals are freedom for all, justice for all, liberty. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but at least with Juneteenth, we're putting the focus on those American ideals, and we're trying to force the United States to live up to those ideals, the ideals that we have so elevated, the ideals that are so lofty, the ideals that we said are the benchmark of American democracy. And I want to put a lot of emphasis on that reflection and that solemn remembrance, and that we just don't get lost in the celebration. The celebration is important. The rejoicing is important. The parades are important. But also to really think about what this means and what we're going to do with it and how we're going to move forward. Well, I'm going to end on a light note, and that's food, okay? Because food is important. That's an important part of Juneteenth, and it has a lot of meaning. You know, the foods are red. Usually on Juneteenth, people sort of focus on the red foods. And the reasons are many. Some say, well, it represents black resilience and black innovation. It represents freedom. It represents all these positive things. But it also represents the suffering and the blood that has been shed by so many African Americans over this whole period of enslavement and since. We cannot forget the period after, what happened after the end of enslavement. Things weren't all rosy and hunky-dory. There was Jim Crow, there was lynching, there was the birth of the Klan, the white chameleons. There was so much going on that oppressed blacks, and we can still argue. I don't think I'll get a lot of argument that we're still having problems with issues of racism and discrimination. But I'm going to talk about food. So the food is red. So not only is it red because it represents something very, very powerful in our culture, but it's supposed to harken back also to Africa, where red in certain African societies, red represents freedom, it represents spirituality, it represented life, it also represented death. So it speaks to where we are now, but it also harkens us back to our African ancestors. And that's the same thing with red drinks. Red drinks, of course, represents some of the sadness in our history, but it also represents some of the positive things in our history, the positive things about black people, the resilience of black people, how we were able to fight back and survive the horrors of this slavery Holocaust. And also it harkens back to Africa because of the cola nut and the hibiscus, which were both, colas are both red and white, and you could make drinks out of that. And of course, the hibiscus is, you can make tea out of that, red tea. So not only is it a very, very serious holiday, a holiday where we reflect, where we think about where we have been, where we need to go, but it's also a very joyous holiday. And I think it combines both of those. So that's my brief overview of Juneteenth. So thank you.
So I'm going to move into the second part of the program, and I'm going to be talking about works from the museum's collection. So I picked two works from the museum's collection. We're going to start with Jar by the artist David Drake. And these works speak to me in how I'm thinking about legacy, freedom, and grounding of self. So on screen, we have a beautifully made object. And I remember when I started at the museum in 2022, walking up the third floor galleries and just being struck by the marvelous craftsmanship of this jar. It's very beautiful in its utility and sort of the mundaneness of the object, and you might walk past it, but I want to call out two moments in this work. So you see the maker's mark in two areas. So you see the artist's fingerprints right here, and you see that there's text as well. So the text reads, LM, June 6, 1857. And I want to call this out specifically because of the maker. So David Drake was an enslaved potter born in around 1801 in Edgefield, South Carolina. And the reason I'm calling this out is Drake's work interrupts the erasing of African American and Black contributions to American decorative arts, but American history in general. And when David was alive, reading and writing was illegal for enslaved populations. And so looking at this jar, I imagine a man who's resilient, who defied conventions of the time, and has said, I want to be remembered. Maybe he wasn't thinking, I want to be remembered for generations, but I think it's something wonderful that because he wrote his name, we can continue to speak about Drake and we can come back to David Drake. And I look at this jar and I wonder, what was his life like? Who was his family? What were the conditions that he was living under? And we can, because his name is here, we can continue to have these conversations about a single maker. And there are many, many unnamed makers. There are many, many unnamed makers and builders that have constructed what is now the United States. And so I want to give a moment to just reflect on what it means to be able to come back to a named maker. And how, because he wrote his name, we can continue to talk about him in this legacy of freedom. The legacy of imagination. I wonder what his dreams were. And again, because we have his name, we can maybe start to parse out those questions. The next work, this object is also on view in Gallery 336. So I encourage you after the program today or a different time at the museum to really spend time with this object. It's a really, really powerful work. And I think it's a kind of work that begs a sort of admiration and contemplation. So the next work that we have on behind me is entitled Girl with Pigtails. So this work is by the artist Augusta Savage. a recent acquisition, Gallery 333. And when I think about liberation, when I think about history, when I think about freedom, when I think about imagination, when I think about future, I'm instantly drawn to teachers and education. So Augusta Savage was working during the Harlem Renaissance, had a career as an artist, but she also had a pretty long-established career as a teacher. And she said her legacy were her students. And thinking through when you're teaching someone, your legacy persists past you because your students continue to create. Your students continue to take what you've given them and make something new. And so, for example, an artist who was a student of hers, Norman Lewis, even though he did not go on to become a sculptor, he credits his time with Norman Lewis as incredibly important to him. Because he said just knowing that there was a Black woman creating art during this time, it was incredibly difficult, was really impactful for him. So when we're thinking about Juneteenth, we're thinking about legacy, we're thinking about imagination, we're thinking about future, and how do we conceptualize Black futures? What does it mean to have a Black future? What does it mean to have a legacy? And how do artistic traditions lay to that? So right now I'm going to introduce our panelists. So I'd like to invite onto stage Brianna McIntyre. Brianna is a textile and fabric artist working in St. Louis. I'd like to also invite Andre Fuqua. Andre is an engineer based in Austin and St. Louis, and together they make up Occupy Vacancy. Occupy Vacancy is an art collective, a public arts initiative in St. Louis that's re-envisioning public-owned vacant lots in the city. I'd also like to introduce Patrick Earl Hammy to the stage. Patrick is a professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's a printmaker and painter, and together we're going to sort of kind of tease out what it means, what artistic legacies exist in Juneteenth and because of Juneteenth. So I invite you all to speculate with me for the next 45 minutes. Let's just hop to it. So the first question that I have is for you, Patrick. Can you just walk us through your practice really briefly?
Yes, sure. Thank you again for having us to the museum, for letting us engage in this conversation tonight. Very excited to be here and expand more on all our works. And thank you so much for a beautiful grounding in Juneteenth that really, I think, frames us in something I believe we're all connected to, which is history. And what I would say specifically is a kind of legacy of Sankofa, you know, the Ghanaian tradition of going back and getting it. And so in that spirit, kind of talking about my work, I wanted to go back to one of my earlier paintings from 2009 called Recognition on the left. And that really set the groundwork for a lot of the ways that my practice today, which I'll be talking about more later, came to be. So with Recognition, I was working through a crisis of maturation in Black male identity. We were at a moment in 2009, or while I was developing this project, 2007, 2008, and doing the work in 2009, where I was confronted with, who am I? That's the question I was asking. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thanks. How do I understand my own self, my own Black body, through the legacy of the enslavement block, all the way to the presidential lectern, or in this case, the Oval Office. And so I was working through a project that explored maturation, identity, becoming, moving from objecthood to subjectivehood. And when I found myself in 2020, stuck inside, like a lot of us, during the national stay-at-home order, a few things started to bubble back up. With a lot of time, a lot of space, I was looking for joy. Where could I find joy in my life? For some of us, it was with Ted Lasso on Apple TV. That was pretty fun, joyful space. But for me, I wound up returning back to my childhood and revisiting Soul Train. So for everyone in the audience that might not know Soul Train, from from 1971 to 2006, it was a musical variety television program that celebrated in the glitz and sway of the Black imagination. It introduced us to the dance, the vibes, the clothing, the fashion, the moves of a generation. It was inspiring. It was a spectacular and speculative space that allowed us to dream and access from a safe location of our homes through the TV set, and find community, with each other, with our friends next day at school, or developing parasocial relationships with the figures we saw on TV. So I returned to that with an adult eye during 2020, and I went through hours and hours of footage. Now, my practice is rooted in representation. Portraiture and storytelling and the politics of representation are what I work with. Historically, that's taken shape in oil painting and drawing. And so in 2020, I was locked out of my studio. My studio was on the campus of University of Illinois. I couldn't access it. Everything was closed down. So I set up shop in my basement and started to draw. I started to just really study all the compositions and the scenes of Soul Train. I reviewed hours of footage, looked at interviews, and there's amazing interviews from dancers currently on their reflections back on Soul Train on YouTube. It was a great feast to dive into. And so these are some of the drawings that came out of that time. Very intimate, really small, inspired by printmakers like Getty Koolwitz, but also Japanese mangaka and Japanese manga, comic making. And so I really stayed simple with just black and white, no color, just really seeing what the shape and the form could express. That was quickly interrupted in 2020 with the death of George Floyd and many others. I was ripped from that reverie, ripped from that space of joy, even during this time when I was afraid to go outside. I was afraid to be with other people. I was also afraid to go outside for other reasons and to be in the car driving and being black. And with all this space and time, as I threw myself into other levels of nerditude, that the closer and more close you get to know me, I'm a huge comic book fan, huge movie buff. I had to access my feelings about George Floyd and many that we were losing, personal and publicly, to murder and police violence and racial discrimination through horror. I found myself returning to the first place I encountered lynching, and that was the film Candyman from 1992. I found myself revisiting that film, watching it, and finding so many stark and dark parallels that I would not have connected as a kid. For everybody who doesn't know the show or the movie, the main character, Candyman, is an artist, or was in his life, was an artist, a portraitist, was a freeman. His father was enslaved and was freed, and he was born free. And he was commissioned by a white man to paint this white man's daughter. They fell in love, she became pregnant, and that didn't sit too well with her father. And so, spoilers, if anyone hasn't seen a 1992 film, he winds up being lynched, tortured, and smeared with honey and murdered by bees. Terrible. But to a kid, that was my first introduction to what that level of hate what that level of an effort to control one's body and to shape one's community might look like, and how I might be affected. And as an adult who was steeped in so many of these histories of being an artist, of having loved, many different races, how my body was subject to these same types of injustices today. Other bodies like mine could be and are. And so I turned to lynching as a subject matter, looking at archives, looking at a really great resource, Without Sanctuary, a book Without Sanctuary, and developed some of these collages here digitally that pulled from those images and separated the murderers from the victims in the backgrounds and isolated them. Eventually I wound up marrying these kind of two American histories, these two American pastimes, these family-friendly events, very different, together in these installations where I had my drawings in direct conversation with these wall-painted silhouettes that showed the mob and the horror. That was kind of the beginning of a project that I'll talk more about as we keep going on tonight, which I call Soul Train, an anthology of American hauntings, where I hope to point to the then, whether it be Soul Train from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or American lynching, going back from the end of the Civil War all the way, some could argue, to today. And through pointing to the then, talk to the preciousness of having these frank conversations now.
Okay, yeah. Hi, everybody. Let me keep clicking here.
Don't worry, we'll come back to these images.
Oh, yes.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. So a little bit about me. Thank you, Charlie, for your introduction and for putting this together, by the way. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure the audience does as well. So my practice is somewhat hard to define, but it does kind of round itself in certain categories, particularly with fiber art, and as well as design and furniture design. But today I think I want to focus on the fiber art aspect of my practice. And it's funny because I've always been really interested in clothing and things that adorn the body and things that are very personal to us, and I think that's why I naturally gravitated towards it. And all of my work, of course, is within the lens of a Black woman living in America, and so much of what I try to break apart is a beauty complex, and just the beauty politics of being a Black woman and living sometimes against the background of a white wall, especially thinking about like my time growing up. I grew up actually around predominantly white audiences or spaces because of schooling and church, and I think that's something that really impressed upon me of just being in these spaces and feeling very othered in ways that are more subtle. And I think you'll see that in my work. My work tends to be really delicate, which I love as well because of just the necessity for Black women to be strong. We also need to be soft and delicate as well. So I love to kind of play with that. And I'll talk a little bit about this piece in front of you. So this hair composition is actually hair that I got from a friend, and I just kind of was just using this object and just playing with it and creating something out of it. And I love this amorphous shape that came out of it, these curves, and always trying to reference the body, trying to reference narratives that I have experienced. Okay, yeah, so this next one is an installation back in, what was that, 2018, yes. Okay, so this this bell curve shape that I was creating with the steel, creating the slope, thinking about statistics, thinking about also just these materials, the hair, and being up against this white background, but also having yarn kind of delicately wrapped around it, kind of again obscuring, covering, again, just this conversation of the subtlety sometimes of racism, you know, and I think that's important to address as well, because that's how it sneaks in. Things are subtle and then things grow from there. And I think that I tend to play with that and think about precariousness, you know, just that concept of life. And yeah, so I'll continue on with that because I know we have more to talk about. Yes, again, so this was just a piece that I am, again, just thinking about sexuality and, you know, sexualization of bodies and beauty politics and kind of subverting and reintroducing materials that wouldn't normally go together and seeing how they respond, and something that was kind of maybe associated with violence, you know, when actually you use it, it's very soft and delicate, and I think it's about somehow finding healing in these objects or subverting them in a way that speaks towards experience, and of course always referencing the body. There we go. So this piece is not particularly pertaining to Black women. This was actually a piece that, well, I think a lot about women labor in my work as well. I think with the fibers work, also in my practice, just working a lot with wood and just thinking about the body and the hidden labor, a lot of times, of women, and thinking about ways that I want to bring that forward and kind of talk about that and give name to it. So this piece is talking particularly about Southeast Asian women and thinking about just, you know, sweatshop factories and, you know, just kind of asking questions about, you know, where things come from and, you know, just the precariousness again of sometimes being born in a different country. You know, as Americans, we're still very privileged, and, you know, even in our struggle, we are still very privileged, and that was just something I was meditating on. I'm also part of a teachers collective in Chicago. This particular project we did with the Let Us Breathe Collective. The collective that I'm a part of, Project Feeling, is comprised of women and non-gender conforming people who offer tooling camps where they teach the same about tool literacy, which is something that I'm really passionate about, and as well as collaborating with organizations that align politically, philosophically. This particular group is really trying to imagine a world, you know, kind of in the same space that Angela Davis did, you know, with like a world without police, a world without jails, you know, all these things, like, you know, kind of just this reimagining of like, can we take our minds and imagination to like this level that, again, just we haven't seen it, and I think that that's really important. And these particular structures were about creating spaces that could be workshopped into ways to help the organization, and they could be joined together. There were 4 large pieces, and then 2 carts that we made, but they could also be joined together and create resistance architecture is what we called it. So, yeah. And this is, again, just me thinking about, well, not again. Well, I think this was about me kind of thinking about the history of redlining, mapping, colonialism, you know, kind of just partitioning of land, and, you know, how arbitrary that seems, it feels when I'm looking at a map and I'm like, why is this line there? And I was just going through and doing some exploring and some mapping out where I would take a string and I would just, you know, kind of drop it delicately and try to create something that looked like a map, and just pinning it out with little pins that actually looked like flags, and that was very tedious but weirdly enjoyable, but also it made me contemplate as I was carving out these scapes, you know, just that history. This was actually a piece I did in Texas. I was responding to a group exhibition, and the name was called Location, Location, Location. And I had lived in Texas at that time for a year, and just understanding the history of Juneteenth and being in Texas was, it was a culture shock in some ways. You know, I think I had some adjustment that I had to do with that, and I think again, just understanding the strong lines that are drawn in the history and thinking about the history of the destruction of African American neighborhoods in order to make way for projects. So you can think about, you know, the highway in this particular instance, or Central Park in New York. There's a long history of that happening. And I was using the intersection MLK and 35, or I-35, as a starting point to kind of create this division between East and West Texas, which was the dividing line in terms of racial segregation. And then, oh, wrong one. And that's my work. Thank you.
Hi everyone, again. So I'm Andre, and so my practice, I like to say, is rooted in structure and landscape. I'm an engineer by training. I studied civil engineering, and then kind of took I guess had an aha moment that I wanted to be an artist. And so now my practice is really rooted in my experiences in migration. I was born here in St. Louis. I have a very large family that comes from Alabama. And then I left and, you know, spent a lot of my time in New York, Chicago, now live in Texas. So I've kind of done this, I don't know, big loop. I like to say, you know, I'm a guy with a Midwestern heart with some Southern influence and, you know, a little big city flair. And so, you know, my work is I'm really interested in ideas of power and perception, and really, you know, giving voice to the voiceless, and also these concepts of invisibility. And so the work that you see right now comes from a series of portraits. These are actually two members of my family. I have a very large extended family. My mother has 12 brothers and sisters. I see my mom back there. What's up, Mom? You know, this section of Alabama is very much a small town. And so I like to call my family kind of a Black American tribe, because there's so many of them. But also, you know, a lot of people don't necessarily see these individuals, you know, like this specific series. You know, the individuals, these are two of my uncles, kind of in this rocking chair, this space of contemplation in the Black American South, and really just wanting to, you know, wanting people to see them. There are about 12 of these photos in this series. The images you see here are kind of, in addition, you know, speaking towards invisibility. At the time, I was really deep reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And so really thinking of these concepts of invisibility in the Black male body, and how I was experiencing that as well, and wanting to also really thinking of like, you know, power and perception, and this ideal of the silhouette, okay? Silhouettes kind of have this interesting history where, you know, sometimes they're used to represent people that are, you know, of high stature, like royalty. And then on the other side, you know, there's like silhouettes of people who are like fugitives, okay? And, you know, wanting to play with that space, and also think of this ideal of like invisibility as a Black man. The next work, this is one of my favorite pieces, is a piece called Seal. And we'll talk a little bit more, you know, about naming and things later. But this was, you know, my kind of take on America. thinking of materiality. The piece is steel. You can't really see here, but all of the stars in the field are actually silhouettes of my head. And so it's like, I was thinking a lot about, again, material, this idea of placement and the American flag, these ideas of Alabama and convict leasing in steel, kind of all are embedded in this work. And then finally, I want to jump to this one, a piece called Mason Jar. Probably like a lot of people in the audience remember, canning fruits and peaches and preserves and, drinking things out of a mason jar. And then, I go to the hottest club or a hot club in Brooklyn and I'm getting a $17 cocktail out of a mason jar. And I'm like, all right, here we are, and really thinking about, this ideal of material ethos and understanding how a material or how an object can kind of speak and have different representations that are tied to place. And this was really an exploration of that. So yeah, I'll stop there, and then maybe we can continue with questions.
So this panel is sort of situated as a conversation between all the artists and myself. And so let's talk about medium. Let's talk about materiality. Specifically thinking about occupied vacancy and your works with bricks. And bricks have a very localized history in St. Louis as well. So let's just talk about material and how the medium is the message.
Yeah, I would say that, St. Louis is a brick city. St. Louis, there's so much amazing brick architecture in this city. And if you want to maybe jump to the actual piece, yeah. The title of the piece is Right of Location. And we'll get to it in just a second, but the piece is an entirely brick work. And that was very intentional. Thinking about language, thinking about how we are communicating ideas, specifically this idea of, filling these vacancies in St. Louis and really wanting to be speaking the same language, I guess, through material. And so I think that this piece is a representation, as we think of creating new futures and seeing new visions, it really is a representation of the past and what could be. Okay, we kind of have this this pattern or these shadows that kind of suggest, forward-looking. Okay, this kind of cross and these, impressions kind of in the piece where things are literally facing north. You're looking at it right now, and the picture, is south-facing. But I guess for those who don't know, St. Louis is a pretty divided city. Delmar Boulevard, north side versus south side. We work specifically on the north side of the city, and so the work and the material, I think, definitely suggests that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to talk about the changes that happened in planning this. We knew we wanted to do something, and we had a lot of ideas of what we wanted to do, and I think actually sometimes when you're kind of down to the wire and you have to go with that gut instinct, we knew that we needed to make it out of brick. And I think that is something that when we were in the process of making it, it instantly connected us to the neighbors. They would be a lot of people stopping and asking, what are you doing? How did you do this? Oh, you got an LRA lot? How did you get that? Because there was a lot of red tape that you had to go through just to even access and, try to do something. I mean, talking about freedom, we're talking about the freedom to try, and I think, thinking about a material that's so connected to our history and thinking about how can we play with it and continue to push it and because we do want to continue that significance, but we also want to kind of push it to the future. And I think this was, we actually, a lot of these patterns, this cross pattern was something that I just saw driving on Vandenbender. You know, it's just, this is directly inspired from the architecture that's surrounding it. And I think that's important to say as well. Yeah.
And Patrick, let's talk about materiality in your work.
Yeah, it's beautiful seeing that piece. You said seal. You know, how it points to the flag. I mean, today's Flag Day. Yeah. And thinking about silhouettes, you know, thinking about the silhouette, I mean, our connective tissue here, you know, how powerful the silhouette is. So I was working with silhouettes in the previous works I just showed you on the wall, and I was stunned when I started showing those works in exhibitions, and people that would come to see them would revel in the Soul Train, but wouldn't really connect with the horror of the mob, right? They detached themselves from it, which was kind of the opposite of my point. So I found myself needing to spend time with the mob, you know, something that I didn't really want to do more of. But I did. I dove into it, moved toward it, and began a series of gestures and drawings where I would mirror, flip, rotate, and develop these mobs into almost these Rorschach-like projections, right? That was me hitting on the visual, but then I needed to really think again about the material. And for me, I returned back to the material and the practice that I was first encountering a lot, and many people were first encountering the source material, the archive of these images, which was postcards. These are postcards that were shared. I mean, it was like social media of the time. Like you were at these events, you brought your family, you brought your barbecue, your lunch, your dinner, and you reveled in Black Death. All in service of speculating safe and secure white futures. You know, I had to also wrestle with these postcards had, you know, very detailed and aspirational and mean inscriptions on the back, where people were really hoping that the community coming together to do this violence would lead to safer, more prosperous futures for their kids. Okay. So with that, I moved into printmaking. I worked with some amazing people. One's here tonight, Heather in the audience. And do I need to, here we go. And I started down the road of making 17 unique prints in editions of 3, where I explored these different kind of Rorschach shapes and these various iterations. For me, they became a space to more slowly contemplate the horror, for us to bring, and I mean us collectively as an audience, you know, everybody's going to bring individual bias to it, but for us to access the story and these histories and these images from our own biases, from our own expectations, and have some more slow time to contemplate our positionality to these histories and to these images. And so that's when I hit on making these prints. And after I had developed these 17 unique prints, the iterations started getting darker and darker and more layered, almost to the point where they're mostly just blacked out. And so that's when I shifted, inspired by Norman Lewis, who's in the collection. I shifted into making paintings using the blackest black you could get, called Black 3.0 by Stuart Simple. The blackest black out there is called Vanta Black, which you can't get because Anish Kapoor, an artist in Chicago, copyrighted it, so only he can use it. So this second blackest black, everybody can use except Anish Kapoor. So I found myself making some really big black paintings, about 10 of these, and I painted them on linen. And for me, the linen, with the black being so pitch, so potential, was important. You could look into it and not even really see the surface anymore. It was almost like a hole. And then I painted them on linen, which for me was also a symbolic material. It's a material that in painting and in elite cultural practices points to privilege. It's a material historically associated with Egyptian burial rites. But it's also, I think, primary in this conversation, a material associated with enslavement. You know, it was a technology that allowed the perforation of wealth via the capitalists that enslaved bodies, allowing enslaved peoples to work in the fields and not die from heat exhaustion. It allowed the possibility for exploitation on a mass scale. And so I wanted that to be embedded in the materiality of the paintings, similarly to how I wanted the silhouettes I was painting on the walls, even when the shows were taken down and the show was over, when they were painted over, to be embedded in those walls, in those institutions, especially those art institutions which are not exempt from these histories, that also carry these colonial practices of exploitation, exclusion. And so just to answer the question, the materialities that are on the surface, the materials of the space, the materials of the archive are something I think about deeply, and I hope informs the reading of the work if people keep going beneath the surface.
Thank you for that. What's coming through in all of your answers is that you all have a research-based practice. And in doing that research, that puts you very, very close to the source material, per se. And I think being so close to a long history of disenfranchisement, of pain, of violence, directed at people who look like you, that continues into the present, can be very, very taxing. So as you find yourself in the archives or doing the research with the community, in what ways are you taking care of yourself? Because I mean, like Gwen said, Juneteenth is a holiday of celebration, but it's also a solemn holiday. And you kind of have to balance those two emotions and those two depths.
Self-care. Yes, self-care. Oh man. It's learning, like learning on a job. Like I've always moved toward subject matters that are difficult. Difficult technically, difficult emotionally, but this was another level. I found myself like within archives with the books, standing over copy machines, holding books down, and then with the bed up and seeing with the hood up, and seeing myself reflected in the bed of the scanner, resuscitating this past, and being hit with the weight of that and having to sit down. I had to learn a lot from my, I would say, younger black colleagues at the university who were also navigating research-based practices into these histories and contemporary practices. And they were much more in touch with how to take care of themselves than I was. I mean, everyone's still learning, but similar to Brianna, I grew up in very interracial kind of situations. My godfather and godmothers were white, and so navigating those communities became really, really, easy in some ways. And growing up with the kind of expectation I had to be the best in order to be equal. Whether it was in sports and art and education, was something that drove me until this moment. Mm-hmm. And my colleagues, they actually created a situation that forced me to pump the brakes and realize like pushing through this is not okay. This subject matter is heavy. The subject matter is it's a labor to carry, but it's a marathon. It doesn't need to be a sprint.
If I may respond to that, that resonates with me a lot, actually. As someone who is continually learning and on the journey of finding balance within the practice and taking care of oneself. Something that I really enjoyed when Miss Gwen was on stage and talking about like food and just, the color red. I actually love hibiscus tea. That's like something that I know, like, just like little things that you do to take care of yourself. I think my work in particular, and I'll actually, where's the clicker? Get to this work in particular was something that was emotionally and physically exhausting to do. This would not have been possible without actually kind of enlisting the help of some people around me, because the amount of boxes that I created and the amount of time that I had, everything is, I think a lot of times when you're in the arts, sometimes you're up against a deadline. In an ideal world, you're never up against a clock, and you can just make and take your time. But sometimes it is that time where you're pressing, and I think that I'm learning all the time to slow down. But this particular piece, I had a friend who was literally swimming in the lake and like dropping rocks and then tying them to the little I guess buoyed up kind of fiber sculptures, because otherwise they would just float away, and it was just like this whole orchestra. And I think it's important to have those moments, but it's really important to rest. And I think I'm learning all the time how to do better, and I'll be learning my entire life to how to do better with that, but yeah.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Self-care for me is music. I very much believe that music has a healing quality, and it's a language that, I might not be able to speak your language, but I can rock to this beat with you, okay? We can understand what makes you feel good, and so in moments of stress, I feel like, which actually doesn't really come out a lot in my practice. We were talking about, me being a piano player and like things a little bit earlier, and I was like, yeah, I'm actually like, I love music. And I realized, really in recent years, how much it really serves as a space to calm me in moments of stress, I feel like you have the clicker. I'll go back to this work. And this work for me really came at a time where I was honestly really angry, thinking about, just stresses I was going through in my life, like thinking about, the country and just feeling unseen, I guess, in many ways. And so, during this process, I kind of jumped back into like music and like walking, I guess, like this practice of just like, okay, I want to put on this playlist or whatever, and then or like drive, or then like just walk and like use this as a moment of inspiration, but also as a moment of healing. So yeah, I'll stop with that.
So I'm going to ask one more question before I open it up to Q&A from the audience. Just as a reminder, 2 of my colleagues will be walking around with a microphone. Please speak into the microphone so everyone in the auditorium and the Zoom audience can hear you. So I want to get into, or just tap into, the power of naming and how that relates to your work. So I think one of the important things about Juneteenth is that Juneteenth places a name to a very specific history and a legacy of history in the United States of America. And that's why we have Juneteenth, because we're speaking back to this history. And so if your work of Occupy Vacancy, you're speaking to these vacant lots, but by creating the work, you're giving agency and bringing these histories to the forefront. You're naming that there is this care that was given to North St. Louis. And Patrick, with your work, with the prints, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the titles are taken from the places that the lynchings happened. So you're implicating the onlookers in that instance. So let's talk about like naming and the power of naming, the power of language.
I'll start off, and I wanted to go to this image. We had touched before about this idea of Del Mar, and I think that this is a really powerful infographic just to show like the stark differences on that this street has, in the city, and thinking of the position of our work, and here's another image that really shows these vacancies, okay? The things that, you can see the density that's literally above this one line that is Del Mar in the city. And so when we think of the name of our work, Right of Location, and that being inspired by like rite of passage, okay? And thinking of us establishing, being right on the cusp, I guess, of this dividing line, and wanting to have, this piece really exists as like a historical marker or as a representation of newness, okay? Thinking of like where it is. This is like the rite of passage, the rite of location, okay? This is a marker of a freshness for this space, of new vision for maybe St. Louis. And I think that when we think of naming, that was definitely something that was very crucial to the creation and how this work materialized.
And I'll just add to that very quickly. Yes, just talking about, rights, RITES, just to want something one must go through, it's almost a rite of passage, all of these terms, and thinking about the impression left on these vacancies and these lots, and what these preconceived notions are just automatically placed onto that, and then there follows policy that affects, education, housing, access to food, all of these things. And it's not that there's not a desire or even pushes to do so. There's actually, I think it's really important to acknowledge there's a long history of people fighting these vacancies and trying to come up with ways to enliven areas that have kind of been stricken. So yeah, just again, that naming is really important, yeah.
As Patrick orients his slides, I also just want to bring up, we're also talking about power. Who has power? Who has the power to tell certain stories? Which stories are being told? And that's all tied into power.
So yeah, I want to talk about naming, but I didn't want to skip talking about music and how it was such an important healing aspect and important part of this project. So this QR code right here, since it's not really, can't visualize music, takes you to a playlist on Spotify if you want to use that platform, that with a curated list of 9 hours of music that goes along with this whole body of work, that taps into everything from Soul Train to Brianna Giddens and the banjo to all the way up to more contemporary practices. I mean, she's contemporary as well, but and so that was a huge part of this process and thinking through and healing and staying present and trying to find how to bring that into the practice, because I never did it before. So that was a space of growth. Yeah, as Charlie was mentioning, the naming, and I named sites from in these collages, or I guess they're collages, yeah, that become these kind of paintings and prints from the sites and the locations. This is all about community. It's all about the aspirations of a community, whether you're the living embodiment of your ancestors' dreams in Soul Train, in the symbolic space of Soul Train and what it represents, everyone who participates in it, what it means to a community to look on and see yourself reflected on the TV weekend after weekend, to the more darker speculative space I mentioned with some white communities and the ways that they work to reinforce their community values through these horrors. These sites, these communities, these locations, they connect us to place, they connect us to American history, they connect us to the scars that are left, sometimes visibly, sometimes more ephemerally in the community and the histories of sundown towns and the echoes that get whispered down through family lines of what happened to who and who was doing what when. And so, again, in a slower way, I hope that the naming in that regard begins opening up possibilities of asking more questions. And that kind of brings me to the newest iterations of these works, where I've kind of found these spaces of kind of reintegrating Soul Train as a gesture with the abstracted and more visibly silhouetted gestures of the mobs. In the naming of these, whether they be Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, or Exley Passion and Pain, or a more recent one, Nightbirds, to hopefully instill a new curiosity, a fresh curiosity. You know, as most of us in here, I can see from the head nods in the audience, we're familiar with Soul Train and its importance, right? As I've been traveling around post-stay-at-home order, we're still in a pandemic, and was able to talk to younger people, they didn't know these histories either. They didn't really know these deeper, darker American histories connected to American lynchings, and they didn't know the more recent histories connected to Soul Train. And so I hope that the naming in these works, whether they're the artist or the song, can inspire a fresh curiosity in younger people to ask more questions about their own histories.
Thank you. We're going to take questions from the audience. Raise your hand. I think so. There's a question back there, Leslie.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one, the brick, I'm calling it like a pyramid to me. What, is it a name on it? Is it a title? And where is it at? You said Vanderveer and what?
Yes. I want to click back to it actually while I speak. So the name of the piece is Right of Location, R-I-T of Location. And it's located at 3960 Enright Avenue in the Vanderveer neighborhood. You had a first question too, sorry.
No, that was the question.
Was that, okay, I thought you had more.
Okay, the second question is for all three of you all, but the same question, but different pieces. Okay. Okay. Brianna.
Yes.
Okay. How did you come up with the title, Parable of the Hidden? Where were you within your mind at that time? And did you think of the title before or after creating the artwork?
The title always comes after, I think. I am trying to express something, and I allow me to kind of gravitate towards a material that's appropriate for that. And with things that I was thinking about, I grew up in, it's one thing that I did was grow up in the church. So thinking about parables, thinking about what is the point of a parable? It's to be able to break down something in very simplistic terms. But then I was also reading or thinking about texts, Parable of the Sower. Yeah, just thinking about these dystopic situations that are plaguing us and affecting, in this particular piece, women in particular. And yeah, so that was, and then with the Maiden, actually you can go back, oh, wrong way. Just gonna jump, almost there. There it is, okay, yeah, the Maiden, just again thinking about, just questioning things again about where things are made and where and who are the people that touched these articles of clothing, who are the people whose work they passed through their hands, and just, just again recognizing just the global economy that we're in. Remembering that everything is attached to someone in some way, and just thinking about that line of it starting there and coming here, and just thinking again about the story of that person.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Same 3 questions, Andre. Forget me not, and especially Seal.
Yeah, I'm going the wrong way. Oops, oh gosh. Let me go over here. Boom. So, I have a very similar answer to Brianna, is that, the titles definitely come afterwards. It's interesting because this is one of the only works that I've made that's actually titled after a song. It's titled after Patrice Rushen's Forget Me Nots, and that song is something that, I grew up listening to, but also, just the ideal of forget me nots, okay? I envision, the people that are in these portraits saying that to the viewer, forget me not, okay? Give me my voice, I am here, in a sense. And so, the title comes after the work, and the same thing with Seal. This piece was, again, as I was saying earlier, really coming from a place of feeling very defiant. And to me, Seal is kind of like a stamp, okay? You have a letter and you put your specific seal on that letter and send it off. And so this to me was I'm like, Andre, if you can make your own flag and have a representation of America, what would it look like? And it is this. And I think that the name, kind of speaking to where we said earlier, also allows other people to kind of project onto it, okay? And hopefully see themselves in this work outside of it just being, just a portrait, maybe in my eyes, but, maybe a different type of seal to them.
Thank you. Now, Pat. Same 3. I really like this title. I Am the Night. How did you come up with that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, Soul Train Anthology of American Hauntings is a kind of umbrella title for what's become 3 chapters underneath that. I Am the Night is the second one. The current one with the colorful paintings with Soul Train is I Am Ongoing. And the first one, going way back, was I Am Legend. And all of those are kind of taken references from other sources, like I Am Legend is inspired by Richard Matheson's novel from the 20s, where a scientist, after the world has, through a pandemic, has evolved into kind of human culture, has evolved into vampires, toils violently to either cure everyone and return them back to what they were, or when he can't do that, he tries to exterminate the best he can. And for me, I found that being a metaphor to people, whether it was the murderers in these photographs and postcards from lynchings, trying to toil violently to stave off the world that was changing, regardless of their feelings and their values. They were out of date, and so as I moved into the second phase of I Am the Night, I tapped into another childhood love of mine, which was probably somebody in here probably already knows this one, Batman the Animated Series from 1992, where in the first episode, Batman decrees, "I am darkness, I am vengeance, I am the night, I am Batman." And I was like, okay, well, let's interrogate this vigilante justice a little bit, right? Let's think about that. This very wealthy white man going around and saying he has the way, right? And how can that be another gateway into thinking about a different type of vigilantism, which the lynchers really saw themselves needing to take up. So that's kind of where I Am the Night came from. And I Am was a prefix that is across all of these chapters, which is tied to the Memphis Civil Rights, Memphis sanitation workers strike, where they were picketing with posters of I Am declaring the humanity in the face of terrible work conditions and inhumane standards and of course racism, and it's been used by a lot of black artists in many different iterations to kind of evoke a similar type of feeling, whether it was Nas's album I Am or Beyonce's song I Am Sasha Fierce. I Am has become a kind of another, and Glenn Ligon's used it. I mean, it's out there. So I just wanted to tap into that as a kind of prefix to I Am, and then the night, legend, ongoing.
Another question up here. And then after that question, we have time for one more.
All right. I'm going to hammer it up a little bit. I'm a very proud father. Brianna is my daughter. And I'm very impressed with the collages. I got a hallway with a white wall about that big. Are any of them in print and for sale?
There are 17 and there are editions of 3. Yes.
Okay. And what size did you say?
They're all about 30 by 40.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
We had a question way in the back.
She want me to stand up. Oh my gosh. This is my mother. Can we get a round of applause for my mom real quick, please? Okay, real quick. I forgot your name to the right. I'm so sorry. Patrick. Okay. How many shades of black are there? Is it 50 Shades of Black? I don't know.
That's a whole other movie. I don't know. I was really impressed with using this Black 3.0. Now there's a Black 4.0, which is even blacker than the black I used. I really want to get that and play around with it. For a long time, I had mostly worked in oil painting, and it can get black, but it's a very specific black. And I had never seen a black this black before. It was beautiful. If you get a chance to work with it, I would definitely recommend it.
Okay, and I know you knew the darkest shade. By any chance, you know the brightest or lightest shade of black?
A black?
Yeah.
Whew, I no.
Okay.
I don't.
Okay. Andre. It was something. The one with the flag. I know you said it was named after a song, but we kind of grew up together a little bit, and I know we was like Michael Jackson buds back in the day. I know you said when you did the creation, you was kind of like angry a little bit, and so it's funny because when you was talking about you had thought of a song, I was actually thinking about Michael Jackson, They Don't Care About Us song in my head, because you were saying how angry you were, so that's kind of like the combination I had in my head about it. I don't know if you ever, yeah, that's beautiful.
I was not thinking about Michael Jackson when I was making this work, but I in terms of the energy of the piece and maybe that specific song, absolutely, okay. And thinking and having this type of wanting to be very loud in a sense. I don't know if people know about the artist named Dred Scott. He did a piece where individuals had to walk on an American flag in order to experience, an aspect of the work. And it had all of this backlash, like, I want to say someone tried to, like, convict him, or something, it was really intense. And so I was thinking about that, when making this work as well, and, wanting to really honestly rustle some feathers, with this work, specifically in its presentation.
What was your aha moment? I heard you say that in the beginning. You said that you went to school for engineering, but you had an aha moment that said, I should be going this route. What was your aha moment?
I took a drawing class my senior year of college, and it changed my life. I understood that, I think I understood that, you could be an artist. I'm like, this is a real thing that you can do and, like, make money and, like, be inspired and, live a joyous life. And so that was my aha moment, for sure.
Okay, and I actually don't have a question, but more so a statement for Ms. Brianna. I think it's very admirable and inspiring that you could take something that's nothing and turn it into something. And not only that, you have the ability to use something outside of its usage. Kind of like people, when you see a person, you use them for what you're known for them to be doing, whether it's a career or whatever, but it may not necessarily be their calling or their purpose. And I just think your eye for things is very glorious, and your artistry is outside of art itself. But you could probably walk into a room and see a vacant building or a vacant room and turn it into art or give life to something that was dead for years.
Wow. Thank you so much for your words. That was poetry. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So my last question, I want to acknowledge I kind of skipped over the bios, the sheet that I had with everyone's marvelous bios, kind of walked away. So I want us to just ask, how can we stay up to date with your work and what you're doing? Since I kind of blew past that, but you're all marvelous artists, and I didn't speak to your practice and the depth of your practice very well earlier, but for those who want to explore more of that, like, how can we stay in touch? So social media, website, the whole gamut.
Absolutely. Instagram is where you can find me most easily. I'm Brianna by Brianna. And then also we share an Instagram through Occupy Vacancy. And yeah, we try to update regularly, and our websites are connected to that. I think mine is my full name. It's really long, like Brianna Marie McIntyre, but that's my website if you want to check out some of my work. Yeah.
Yeah, so as Brianna said, all things Occupy Vacancy at Occupy Vacancy, occupyvacancy.com. You're going to find us. Me personally, my Instagram is Dre Fuqua, so DREFUQUA. And my website is also my full name, andrefuqua.com.
Like Andre, my full name will take you to everything, everywhere, all at once for me. Instagram's where I hang out the most. Facebook, I'm there too. So yeah, please find me. Before we wrap things up, I definitely want to say thank you to our interpreters today. Thank you so much.
And again, thank you all for attending this evening and spending this hour and a half with us. I really, really appreciate it, and happy Juneteenth!